Celebrations in Brazil as the lower house votes to impeach President Dilma Rousseff. She's accused of manipulating government accounts during her re-election in 2014. Rousseff says she did nothing wrong. Her supporters are calling it a coup against democracy. Is it game over for Brazil's first woman president? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. Brazil's lower house has voted in favor of the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff. Thousands of protesters gathered outside Congress on Sunday, some in tears and some euphoric as the votes were counted. One MP dedicated his vote to a man who had tortured Rousseff under Brazil's military government. She faces accusations that she hid the extent of Brazil's budget deficit during her re-election campaign in 2014. And many who voted against her in Congress are implicated in corruption scandals. So is Rousseff truly a crook, or is she just a scapegoat? And if she leaves office, what's next for Brazil? Lots to discuss with our guests, but first, Gabriel Elizondo reports from Brasilia.
Truly remarkable scenes from inside the Congress building Sunday night in Brasilia. It started out with some pushing and some shoving between lawmakers. Then there was booing, cheering. We saw one lawmaker, after he cast his ballot, spit on another one. There was another lawmaker that fired a toy gun with confetti after saying what his vote would be. Truly unprecedented, remarkable scenes that we saw there. But in the end, over 500 lawmakers voted overwhelmingly to continue the impeachment process against President Dilma Rousseff. The opposition only needed 342 votes, and they got 367, far and away more than even they were predicting. It was a devastating blow to Dilma Rousseff and her efforts to try to block the impeachment process from going forward. Dilma Rousseff's Attorney General spoke late Sunday night into the early morning of Monday, and he said that there was no plans whatsoever for Dilma Rousseff to step down. She would fight this all the way to the end, he said. Where does the process go now? It now will go on to the Senate. They will start as early as this week analyzing the impeachment request against the president, and they could reach a conclusion as soon as about 2 to 3 weeks from now. Gabriel Elizondo for Inside Story in Brasilia.
So let's talk more then about what happens next. Now, the vote for impeachment will go to the upper house, the Senate, most likely in mid-May. Only 41 out of 81 senators need to support impeachment proceedings for them to go ahead. If that happens, Rousseff will be suspended for 180 days while she faces a trial in the Senate. Vice President Michel Temer will replace her while she defends herself. He would serve out Rousseff's term until 2018 if she is found guilty. Well, let's bring in our guests then for the discussion. In Brasilia via Skype, we have Joao Paulo Peixoto, a political scientist at the University of Brasilia. In Washington, D.C., Mark Langevin, director of the advisory firm BrazilWorks. And joining us from London, Francisco Dominguez, head of the Latin American Studies Research Group at Middlesex University. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. Joao Paulo Peixoto, let me start with you then, since you are where it's all happening. Is there any way for Rousseff to survive this at this point?
Yes, it's always possible. It's not easy, but it's always possible. We have to wait the popular reaction, the social basis of PT, how they are going to react to that. But she's not in a good position because she will have to exercise some powers that she doesn't have. The power to persuade, the power to negotiate. She's not good in that field. So it's going to be very hard to her to get a compromise and survive.
Mark Langevin, how does this look to you? Is it game over for Rousseff?
Well, I agree with João Paulo. There's a possibility, but I've looked at the votes in the Senate. I think it'll easily pass the simple majority to move the process forward into an impeachment trial. And then certainly there'll be a lot of mobilization outside of Congress, outside of the Senate. But I think eventually she will be impeached. But I think that's just one of the questions that we need to address when looking at what's going on in Brazil. This is really an impeachment process constitutionally, but really, aside from that, it's a political mutiny amongst a few of the parties, including the vice presidents, that were part of the government for so long and have decided to go their own way.
So given that, then, should she just resign for the good of the country and let things move on from there?
Well, I think her party, the Workers' Party, that has won every presidential election since 2002, they're not going to give up. As Joao Paulo indicated, they're going to be mobilizing. They're going to look for every opportunity to stop a 2/3 vote in the Senate when it gets to trial. But that's going to be very difficult. I think they will begin thinking about rebuilding the party for the future.
Francisco Dominguez, your take on this, the end of the road for Rousseff?
I don't think so. I think I agree with the other two speakers. I think what they've done with this is they've introduced a huge element of volatility, political volatility. And given that the country is heavily polarized, the people who support Dilma Rousseff and the PT, who are quite a huge bunch, they're very militant, they're very enraged, and I think they're putting pressure on many people whose votes depended very much on that sort of electoral constituency. I think what we're going to see is that if the demonstrations, if the street demonstrations actually prove to the country, or significant sections of it, that the incoming possible government lacks legitimacy, I think there is everything to play for. However, the situation is very difficult for Rousseff. There is no question about it.
You talk there about things being very politically charged right now. Is this, I mean, does she have a real case to answer here when you look at what she's actually been accused of, or is this whole thing politically motivated?
If you compare, I mean, this is being so much discussed in the media. If you compare the number of people and the number of people who are being investigated for corruption, particularly in the lower house, which is about 300, and the vote is 367, people are going to be drawing conclusions there. That's number one. Number two, the actual evidence against people who are involved in corruption, such as people like Cunha, people like Temer, who have been under investigation, are massively enormous compared to what Dilma has been accused of. That pales into insignificant, which is still arguable whether she actually broke the constitution or not. I think many people are going to see this not only internally in Brazil, in the rest of Latin America, but also elsewhere, that this is a politically motivated, and they will call it a coup.
Mark Langevin, when we look at what she's actually been accused of, these sort of accounting violations, I mean, people say there are very dubious grounds for impeachment there. She's basically accused of kind of window dressing government accounts, kind of massaging the books, if you like. There are lots of public officials in Brazil who have done that. And as Mr. Dominguez just pointed out, some of the people who voted to impeach her are suspected of far worse things as well. What does that say then about democracy in Brazil right now, the state of democracy in Brazil?
Well, it's a great question. Obviously, they've lifted the bar, the standards very high. Very few Congress people, very few governors, and very few former Brazilian presidents would meet the standard that's now being applied in this process against the current president. I think in that sense, it's better to look at this as a political process. It's a mutiny by those parties that have the most to gain. And one of the things they have to gain by the Vice President Michel Temer taking over is the possibility that he and Eduardo Cunha, the president of the lower house, who's also been indicted for corruption charges, could work together to try to tamp down these corruption charges. And that's the cloud that is cast over these impeachment proceedings, is that many people believe that this is an effort to protect some of the most corrupt politicians in Brazil, while the president stands charged of some fiscal policy mechanisms that have been used, or comparable policy mechanisms have been used by prior presidents. Also, we also have Michel Temer, the vice president, who acts as the president when President Dilma travels abroad and is signed off over these same fiscal maneuvers. So if you're going to apply this same standard to the vice president, if he assumes the presidency, one has to question whether, you know, he has a legitimate role in this process moving into the presidency of himself. So I agree with Francisco on that point.
Well, let's put that to Joao Paulo Peixoto then. I mean, are the politicians who've gone after Rousseff on this, are they just doing this so they can stop the larger investigations against them, the Petrobras scandal and all the rest of it?
What makes more difficult for her is that she's not a criminal. She didn't any crime, and the accusation on her and the whole atmosphere is leading to a political crisis. I watched all votes yesterday, and 99% accusing her of destroying the economy, unemployment, and the bad political and economic crisis that we are facing in Brazil. As we know, in the presidential system, this is difficult to impeach a president. This is bad management. It's not a crime. So, but the whole population of Brazil, or a large part of the Brazilian population, is unsatisfied, is banning her, blaming her for anything wrong in Brazil. And so this is difficult to defend because she easily can defend herself about the criminal accusation. So in sum, the judgment will be totally political.
Well, let's broaden this out a little bit more then and talk about some of the other main players in this as well. About a third of the deputies in the lower house are being investigated or have already been charged with corruption. That includes 2 of the men waiting to take over if Rousseff is impeached. Vice President Michel Temer would take over. He is facing impeachment proceedings over the same allegations as Rousseff. Second in line to replace her is lower house speaker and architect of the impeachment proceedings, Eduardo Cunha. He is being investigated for taking millions of dollars in bribes. And next in line is Renan Calheiros, head of the Senate. But he is being investigated for links to corruption at state-owned oil company Petrobras. Rousseff's possible impeachment comes at a challenging time for Brazil. The current recession is the worst in almost a century. The national currency has lost about 40% of its value in the last 2 years. Brazil is also fighting an outbreak of the mosquito-borne Zika virus, which has resulted in hundreds of babies being born with deformities. There's no vaccine or cure right now. Both of those crises complicate planning for the Rio Olympics this summer. The International Olympic Committee says preparations for the event are drastically behind schedule. So, Mark Langevin, let me come back to you on this then. We talked there about some of the other personalities in all of this and who might succeed Rousseff. Let's talk about Michel Temer. If he is indeed to succeed Dilma Rousseff, what can we expect from him? What would a Temer presidency look like?
Well, it's interesting because he's been the vice president for 6 years under the presidency of Dilma Rousseff. He's articulated a congressional majority that has, in a sense, supported the public policies of the current administration. And some of those public policies are to blame for the economic recession. But without going into any detail, it's clear that Temer has the votes in the lower house, probably in the Senate as well, to manage some of the day-to-day government activities, some adjustments on the fiscal accounts, maybe some changes in economic policy, macroeconomic policy making. I don't think that's really a problem. The problem is, can he do it and avoid some of the popular mobilizations that Joao Paulo was talking about with respect to corruption? Once he takes the presidency, or at least even if it's temporary during the impeachment trial, all eyes will be focused on him, and we'll learn more about his involvement in some of these corruption deals, some of the log rolling that has taken place to allow this impeachment process to move forward. So I think it's going to be very difficult for a future Temer presidency to maintain the kind of legitimacy you need engage in some of the deeper reforms that many Brazilians are calling for.
Yeah, I mean, Francisco Dominguez, Brazil is facing some huge problems right now. We outlined some of them there, not the least of which is the deep-seated economic conditions right now. But it wasn't. This is quite a. This is quite different from the growth that we saw in Brazil just in the last decade. Millions of people being brought out of poverty. How did it come to this point?
Well, the world economic crisis actually has many economies around the world in tatters. It's not only them. The level of debt of Brazil compares into insignificant with some of the debts in the European countries. It is true that because they depend so heavily on the exportation of raw materials, that they suffer so much, particularly minerals, but not only that, also raw materials in general. But I want to come back to the point of the question of how things can be taken from here. The focus now, if they are able to impeach and oust Dilma Rousseff, the focus is going to be on them, one by one. Huge proportions of the population, we're talking about millions who are very militant in the streets now, are going to draw the conclusion that none of the institutions that they used to rely upon are reliable anymore, are trustable. They're all full of very corrupt people who are actually operating politically. This applies to the lower house, the upper house, the Senate. One can even, I'm sure some of them will even include the Supreme Court. And if the whole business was about the economy, one would have expected responsible politicians to actually come together and then put a sort of national plan to get the country out of the mess. And what they've done is exactly the opposite. They have increased the instability hugely. I cannot imagine that any government that comes out of this in the next 2 years is going to be able to stabilize the situation anyway whatsoever. And if you want to fix the economy, to use a term, one way would be to apply some sort of quite neoliberal tough policies. And I think the population are going to resist that. Already there is evidence and indications that this is the way some of them want to go. And I think if you add that component to the whole picture, then the situation is going to be very difficult. So between 2016 and 2018, without Dilma Rousseff, I think the situation is going to be pretty volatile. I hope that it doesn't end up in violence.
Yeah, Joao Paulo Peixoto, I know you said earlier that you believe that there is a chance that Rousseff can survive this, but there is no doubt that Brazil is a bitterly divided country right now, and whatever happens, her supporters in her Workers' Party are promising to fight this in the streets and in the Senate, they say. Now, it's assumed that means that they're just talking in political terms here. But is there a chance, as Francisco Dominguez said, that this could get really ugly and things could perhaps turn violent?
Well, I agree in part of that argument. But I was thinking that we have to wait to see what role former President Lula is going to play. He promised that he will go to the streets and he will not abandon the streets until the process is over. And as we know, he is a very strong, charismatic, and popular leader in Brazil. So let's see what he's going to achieve in terms of support of Rousseff.
Mark Langevin, when we look at the supporters and opponents of Rousseff in Brazil, how do they divide up? Do they cut across any economic and social lines?
Well, yeah, I think, typically the primary constituency of the Workers' Party in the last several presidential elections have been, the blue-collar, working class, poor families, so forth, that have been somewhat dependent on some of the modest government subsidies to poor families. But a lot of workers, the organized labor movement, most of it has been a very important constituency, the Workers' Party and President Lula and now President Dilma. Where on the other hand, what we're seeing is the pro-impeachment forces really represent kind of private sector, middle-class people that are unhappy with level of taxation. They're unhappy with some of the measures that have actually decreased inequality in a very unequal society in Brazil. We've seen some comments about, maids driving cars to work, and that's not a good thing, when it actually reflects some of the effectiveness of President Lula and President Dilma's policies in narrowing the income gap between social classes and so forth. But I think that's how it kind of pairs out. And then, of course, you have the political parties all vying for prestige, political jobs, the ministries, and so forth. And that's what has stimulated this mutiny, because of the bad economic shape in Brazil, the corruption scandals, even those parties most implicated in the corruption, including the vice president and Eduardo Cunha's party, have in a sense switched teams and now look to advance an agenda that was defeated in the 2014 presidential election. So we'll see how that goes. But I think right now we're moving into a cycle where municipal elections would be very important in September of this year, and then that obviously will fold right into the presidential elections in 2018. So there's a lot of politics in Brazil in the coming months and years.
Yeah, Francisco Dominguez, I saw you nodding in agreement to some of that. How do you see things playing out in Brazil over the next few months?
I don't want to engage in predictions, but on the basis of what we have seen so far, what you seem to have is at the parliamentary level, there is a huge majority for impeachment. And at the society level, there is, more or less 50-50, 60-40, perhaps division, with very active constituency actually, vying for their side of things. And in that context, it seems to me that once and if the Temer team with everybody else, all these other 25 political parties, will come together, the only thing that unites them at the moment will be, one, the possibility of getting jobs, and two, the opposition to Dilma Rousseff. But once that goes away, then the fragmentation will start. Many of these small parties, I personally think, are going to suffer enormously in the regions that many of them use originally the prestige of the Workers' Party, not the government, when things were going well, in order to get elected. And now, as many people will see, that's basically betrayed them. So if you look on the other side, the Workers' Party seems to be pretty united with the most charismatic leader they ever had, Lula, leading the battalions in the streets, as it were. You get the reminiscence of the time when he was a trade union leader back in 1979, leading the masses against the old military dictatorship. It's sort of that old Lula. So he's galvanizing the constituency. The municipal elections are going to be a focal point. The denunciations of whatever government comes onto this, applies. And then there will be the presidential elections. I hope that the people like Temer, people like in the PSDB, do not go for trying to bar Lula legally, which they've tried recently, because that is going to produce an explosion. So the situation looks potentially very volatile, I insist on that, but also many of the small parties are going to suffer. The one party that seems to be very clever, because you don't see him, but is certainly driving the whole thing, is the PSDB. And the PMDB is fronting it. I think they're going to suffer as well.
All right, I'll give the last word, what's probably going to be the last word, to Joao Paulo Peixoto. What do you think the future holds for Brazil over this coming year?
Well, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of political struggle, and the big challenge is to deal with the economic crisis.
And on that, we're going to have to leave it. Thank you to all of our guests, Joao Paulo Peixoto, Mark Langevin, and Francisco Dominguez. And thank you for watching. Remember, you can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Hazem, Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.